Okay, everyone, welcome back. Our next session this morning is titled Understanding Climate Risk, a Foundation for National Resilience. Australia's history of resilience and innovation positions it well to meet the challenges of a changing climate. By understanding climate risks and their impacts, we can take informed, proactive steps to adapt. Our next speaker will explore how turning uncertainty into opportunity can help shape a more resilient future. May I introduce our next speaker, who is Vicki Manson. Now, Vicki is the head of the Australian Climate Service, a partnership between the Bureau of Meteorology, CSIRO, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and Geoscience Australia. It consolidates the Australian government's extensive climate and natural hazard information and capabilities into a single national view for enhanced decision-making. She's had a distinguished career in public policy, bringing over 20 years' experience in managing high-impact programs focused on resilience, resource management, and climate adaptation. Please welcome to the stage Vicki Manson.
Thanks so much. It's quite bright up here. So thanks to the ABARES team who's invited me here today. I will admit I haven't been at this conference for a couple of years, but it certainly played a big role in my career. It's been part of my annual calendar, so I'm delighted to be here to talk today. And I love being back in this sector. So this sector's really, it's got a bunch of practical, action-oriented people, and it's such an enduring quality that I can't tell you, working in a role that works across many sectors, it's not common. So it's nice to be back with you. I'll just start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we're on, the Ngunnawal people, and pay respect to elders past, present and future. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have always had a deep understanding of weather and seasons and the changes that these have impact traditional practices, intergenerational knowledge sharing and caring for country. Climate changes will impact these, and so understanding these is important for protecting all of our futures. Okay, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Australian Climate Service. I'm going to walk through the findings of the recent National Climate Risk Assessment, what these findings mean for the primary industry sector. I'm going to sort of touch on a couple of key watch points and what this might mean for decision makers, and then we'll have an opportunity for discussion. But I do know that the sessions after me is also panel sessions where you can deeper dive into some areas. So just starting off, I really just want to sort of talk through what climate risk and the role of the Australian Climate Service. So the Australian Climate Service, as already noted, it's an agency that was set up to provide authoritative and independent advice and climate risk information to support better decision making. Importantly at a national level, but over time supporting other stakeholders. The Australian Climate Service is a partnership made up of a range of different capabilities: the Bureau of Meteorology, CSIRO, the Australian Bureau of Statistics and Geoscience Australia. The Australian Climate Service was tasked by the Australian Government to develop Australia's first National Climate Risk Assessment. So this national assessment really, as the title says, takes a risk-based approach. And I note it's not about understanding all the characteristics of climate change, so that there are many. Rather, the process helps us understand what is at risk, where, why, and rather than just cataloguing climate changes and hazards, which I think the country's done a lot of, this was about bringing it together to try and understand the so what of those climate changes. So it shifts the focus from a reactive sort of disaster and reactive response to ability to sort of plan ahead and do some proactive risk management. The approach that we took, we tried to do it in a way that would support decision making across a range of sectors, but importantly try and understand what those national risks are that we might need to collaborate and work together to respond to. But the sort of things that we think it helps us answer, it provides us information that supports actions such as what do we need to avoid, what do we need to adapt to, and or what do we need to learn to live with. All hard questions and quite confronting at times. So I won't go through this in too much detail, but just before we go into the risk assessment, I just wanted to give you hold on, I think I've missed a page here. the back. The way we sort of structured our thinking to try and understand how to do the risk assessment, we used the climate adaptation cycle, and I won't go through this in too much detail, but your sector is well familiar with a sort of plan, do, check, review cycle, which we certainly adopted, but we adapted it to really understand and flesh out what we needed to understand for climate risk. The national assessment really sits in that first understand and assess phase for Australia, which does play an enabling role to help sort of the Australian government and other national leaders think about what we might need to do at a national level. So when we released the National Climate Risk Assessment, the Australian government also released a National Adaptation Plan, which was led by the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. They are now progressing a National Adaptation Action Agenda, and that work is happening this year, which really looks at responding to some of the climate risks that occurred at a national level. But I'm just going to give you a bit of an orientation of what we mean by climate risk. So everyone has a slightly different interpretation, or they have assumed view of what climate risk is. So I'm just going to quickly walk us through it so we're on a sort of common footing. So when we talk about climate risk, we're talking about the potential harmful consequences to human, economic, ecological systems from climate hazards. The assessment we did was physical risks only, so we didn't look at some of the transition risks in how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's something that we can consider into the future. But as a first one, doing physical risks was quite hard, so it's definitely something over a next step. But when we think of climate risk, we think of four key themes. So I'm going to walk you through the themes. There's sort of four elements of risk. So the hazards, these are pretty obvious, but these are the climate changes and the natural events themselves. So what are the characteristics of the hazards? So that the hazard might be a heat wave or a flood or a cyclone or a bushfire. But how are they changing in frequency, intensity and geographic reach? We then link that with three other considerations. We look at exposure, so this is what is there, so people, places, infrastructure, ecosystems and assets that are located in areas where hazards may occur. Can't stress enough, exposure is the presence of something that's in harm's way, doesn't necessarily mean it's sensitive to it. Vulnerability, this is what we think might be more impacted. So not everything exposed is equally vulnerable. Vulnerability depends on so many different factors. For example, age, health, socioeconomic status, infrastructure resilience, ecological fragility, etc. And then response. And so a note, compared to other international assessments that countries have done, we're the first country that's included response. And what that really is, it's how we as humans adapt or respond to those risks. So how that shapes risk, both planned and unplanned. And those things can either reduce the risk or can actually make the risk worse. And sometimes we do things that create unintended consequences. So we had a go at that, but probably more in a qualitative sense compared to some of the other aspects. So for the first time, we brought together all of those elements across 8 systems for Australia, and I'll show you those 8 systems in a moment. It involved over 250 scientists and experts. We engaged with over 2,000 people, including decision makers who were responsible for adaptation, to try and make sure that the way we framed the results would help understand scale of the risks and the sort of levers that you might be able to pull. So I'm now going to sort of shift to give you a bit of a taster into the findings themselves. So I'm going to start with the high-level findings of the national assessment. So risks were assessed against 3 global warming levels, 1.5 degrees of global warming, 2 and 3 degrees, and for 3 time frames, so current, 2050, 2090. Note, we can develop the climate scenarios with the global warming levels, but we had to link that to information about other things. So to do population, you couldn't really to make it like for like. So the time frames were linked to the scenarios. So this slide shows the current and 2050 system risk ratings. So if you look across here, there were 8 systems that we considered for the country. So that previous slide where I had what we called the elements of risk. So for each of those, we pulled together the data and information to understand how it would impact each system so we could understand how, across all of those systems, that would impact Australia. So I won't go through all of the ratings, but I'll just note that the current risk rating for primary industries has an elevated, is high, and by 2050 very high. So today's risks are they're sort of concentrated in localised areas, but consequential in those areas. So current impacts tend to be localised, but when they do occur, they influence production capacity, biosecurity pressures, and the resilience of regional communities. But by 2050, the risks sort of expand to more areas and happen more frequently. So the climate impacts will increase, but you'll note, and we'll talk a bit about this later, that the scale of change is not as significant as in some of the other systems. And one of the key themes of what I hope you walk away with today is it's the outside system, your system risks that I think are the ones that you might want to be most concerned about and consider how you can be proactive. So now I'm just going to give you a bit of a taster to the sort of the high-level findings. There's over 2,000 pages in the report, and there's a range of different elements. So I'm just going to give you the sort of high take-home messages. So the depth and breadth of information available can be overwhelming, and we've tried to develop communication materials in sort of bite-sized pieces for different stakeholders. I'll go through some of the high-level messages that you possibly saw when we released the assessment. So no system or location is affected in isolation. Pressures compound and cascade. Extreme and compound events are becoming more severe and frequent and will touch every part of society. And I'll note we're already starting to experience this increased frequency, and I'll note that some of these extreme or hazards are occurring in places that have never experienced those hazards before. Extreme heat stands out as a widespread and systemic risk, particularly across Northern Australia, where thresholds are already being exceeded. In my experience working in this space and doing the risk assessment, although we talk about extreme heat, it doesn't get as much attention, and I sort of feel like it's a bit of a sleeper. We tend to often focus on the big bushfire or the flood that's occurred, and this, for me, is one that I'm quite concerned that we're sort of letting it slowly creep up on us without some proactive action. Natural environments are under significant pressure, so the assessment shows that the degradation of ecosystems and natural assets is a cross-cutting driver which will impact every other system. Climate pressures are eroding the economic foundations we rely on, so that's from productivity and insurance, to supply chains and investment. Coastal communities and remote communities face quite unique and some, quite intense risks and as a result can be quite vulnerable. But we'll go into a bit more detail now into the primary industry findings. So it was one of the key systems. So I'm just going to give you a high-level taster of some of those findings. So thinking back to the graphic I had earlier around the elements of risk, what we did for each system, and I don't expect you to read this whole slide in detail, but we created what we called dashboards where we pulled out each element and sort of tried to provide a really sort of snapshot summary of that element. Now I note that for hazards, for example, we're not saying that the hazards, so there were 10 hazards that we used in the national assessment, we're not saying those other hazards won't impact agriculture. We've drawn out the ones that we think are going to have the most significant impact on agriculture. Just sort of note, so hazards for primary industries, the key ones here are really bushfires, changing rainfall, drought. The changing rainfall, it's not just less rainfall in some cases, but it's the intensity and change rainfall pattern that's really likely to be different and something we need to plan for. Extreme heat and coastal marine changes. And then for exposure and vulnerability, there's a lot of features, and we'll walk through a couple of those, but I think from impacts on the workforce and supply chains to cropping, specific things within each of your industry sectors. Together, these help explain why we rated the rating to go from high to very high by 2050. And in that context, I'm just going to walk through a couple of the tasters of the impacts here. So Not going to go through every single thing in agriculture. I'm just going to give you a bit of a taster. So for broadacre cropping, the risk assessment, pulling those sort of 4 elements of risk together, climate change is significantly affecting the cropping sector, which you're already experiencing. Declining rainfall and increasing extreme heat are major concerns, influencing soil moisture and crop yields. Lower yields are likely in southwest and southern Australia due to changing rainfall patterns and higher evapotranspiration and reduced soil moisture. Extreme heat events add further stress, reducing crop productivity. The changing climate may also create some opportunities in this sector, with reduced frost risk benefiting some regions. Water security is a concern, and with increased drought, variable rainfall and aridity, that further increasing competition for water and will impact productivity and sort of community livelihoods. Forestry. Increasing bushfire are a significant risk, causing loss of timber stocks and higher fire management costs. Higher temperatures stress trees, increasing susceptibility to mortality and pests. At 3 degrees of global warming, projections indicate substantial drying in southwest Western Australia and parts of southeast Australia, creating challenging conditions for forestry. Some cooler areas may benefit from reduced frost damage, improved growth overall, so there are some positives that could come from it. A note, it impacts all areas, but in particular we sort of drew it out for forestry. The outdoor workers and communities linked to the forestry will be exposed to some of those extreme heat and will have a flow-on impact. Livestock. So significant climate-related challenges are emerging. Heat stress in cattle and sheep is increasing due to higher temperatures and more frequent hot spells, reducing productivity and animal welfare. Rainfall variability will increase pasture availability and feed quality, placing added pressures on operations, and then more severe droughts are likely, with impact on financial and emotional wellbeing of producers. Warmer conditions may reduce cold weather losses, improving survivability in some regions. Horticulture. So severe challenges are emerging, particularly in increased extreme heat. So high temperatures can cause fruit sunburn, reduced quality and marketability. Hotter cool season temperatures can affect flowering and yields in temperate perennial crops and tropical crops. Annual rainfall, critical for irrigation, is projected to decline in the southwest of Western Australia and parts of southeast Australia. But again, there's potentially some opportunities with reduced frost risks in some locations. Some of the impact on supply chains across the board in these will sort of impact getting product to market. Fisheries. So fisheries and aquaculture are expected to see productivity declines through a range of drivers. So high marine temperatures, ocean acidity and storm activity will negatively affect marine ecosystems. So at 3 degrees of global warming, almost every day will be a marine heat wave relative to today, which is quite confronting given what we're seeing in South Australia. More frequent and intense marine heat waves will reduce recovery time for coral and create sort of further bleaching events. Wild catch fisheries and aquaculture are highly vulnerable to warming through, I guess, change in the ecosystems. However, the sort of poleward shift is likely to see some change eastern Australian currents that may create opportunities for different fishing zones or locations. So I suppose I think you'll talk a lot about the within ag sector in other talks. I really want to talk a bit more about the beyond the farm gate watch points for agriculture. So what the assessment makes clear is the biggest risks to primary industries don't just come from within the system. Some of the most important pressures are actually from outside of primary industries and agriculture. So how you engage in these things outside of sector, I think, will be really important for your future profitability and competitiveness. So the way we did the risk assessment, and just sort of quickly explain the quick diagram there. So on the left, the government asked us to deep dive into 11 priority risks. So the list on the left are just shorthand of those 11 priority risks. The diagram shows how we used the outputs from each of those priority risk assessments and how we linked it back to each of the systems that we analysed. And I guess the thickness of the line is showing, I guess, how strong a signal there was to that system. And for primary industries, you'll see that, yeah, sure, there is, you know, a thick line from the sort of traditional how you produce your products, but there is a significant other things that are going to impact your competitiveness and profitability. So I'll just highlight a couple. So natural environment, so the declining ecosystems and the health affects water availability, soil condition, pollination, all foundations for productivity. The sort of concerns in the natural environment area were high, and I guess a key part of the sort of step change that we're seeing by 2050 of natural systems will have a flow-on impact to agriculture. Economy, trade and finance, so insurance availability, capital costs and supply chain disruptions are going to be further exacerbated by some of the climate pressures if we don't put some risk reduction and other actions in place. So these financial system shifts will sort of impact on farm decisions, but they happen way beyond the sort of within the farm business. Regional communities and workforce, so heat, housing damage, disaster impacts and economic downturns will affect regional populations, and that will affect the sort of workforce and I guess vibe and atmosphere in many regional communities that we need to be careful and work through how to help particularly respond to events. Workforce, as I noted, heat's a sort of a bit of a sleeper, but workforce and interestingly sport was one that we looked a lot at to look at the impacts of changed heat on how we as Australians do our work, but outdoor work is one that we have to really think carefully about. We looked at, in particular, around responding to particular events, and in future scenarios, we couldn't send emergency service staff out for the same length of time to fight the fires or respond to the event that we could in the past. And we're starting to work closely with emergency services on, well, what does that look like to change how they operate, which I think is the same sorts of considerations we need to think of in workforce in agriculture sector. But these community level risks will influence the sort of day-to-day operations. Infrastructure, so there was a lot in so the built environment and infrastructure system that we looked at. We looked at supply chains and where supply chains would be impacted, and I think if there's more frequent events and those supply chains are interrupted, you may find yourself with amazing quality produce, but you can't get it to where you want to get it, and the need to make sure that you identify and stress test those supply chains that matter most to get your products from your farm or location to ports or to the market, we identified as a real watch point. There was a range of other sort of electricity and telecommunications that we looked at different thresholds and stress tested those. So electricity, I think some of your reliance on cool systems, if that is interrupted, yes, you might have some backups, but there are some areas of the country that have heightened risk to shocks to the electricity system with increased heat or natural hazard events. So part of, I suppose, what I'm really saying is I think this sector really needs to look beyond the farm gate to think about how it manages and responds to climate. Many of the pressures that I think you're exposed to are in other systems and have flow on, so potentially feel outside your control. But I do think some of the ways you could influence those systems create an opportunity for the ag sector. So with that in mind, I'll just sort of flag what some of this means from a decision-making lens. So many of the risks that I've walked through won't be new to many of you. Primary industry has long been considered one of the most adaptive sectors, and rightly so. Many sectors may seek your advice, so I do think that sort of cultural and approach that you have an understanding of whether, I don't think you can underestimate how much you can share that and show leadership outside your sector, and people are sort of starting to look for that. But the adaptation challenge has changed. So yes, you've been resilient and working hard, but I can't sort of walk away from here today to say that acceleration that we're going to feel means you will need help, and you'll need to sort of work out how you're going to keep up with the pace of change that we're expecting and where those pressures are going to come from. So some will be on farm, but as I noted, a large portion will be off farm. So the system risks, I think the way we took a systems approach, and we're the first to really take that systems approach, it did help us understand if something happens in one system, what the flow-on impacts to other systems were, and I think that helps from a policy and investment and research point of view. It helps you sort of work out what your levers are and where you might put your effort, either because you're exposed or actually there's an opportunity for you. So Australia's competitiveness in agriculture and primary industries will depend on how we manage those climate risks across systems, not just on farm. I think there are real opportunities in adaptation, and your session before really talking about technology and different ways that we can adopt new innovations are an opportunity if we get on the front foot. But they rely on conditions often outside of the ag, so we need to think about ways to make sure that you've got reliable infrastructure, stable ecosystems, resilient workforce and functional supply chains. So it's about competitiveness, not compliance. So it's really, if adaptation keeps pace with the risks, Australia remains a reliable exporter and producer of high quality food and fibre and a leader in Australia. But if adaptation falls behind, I think we find ourselves on the back foot and really struggling and scrambling, and I think some of the cascading impacts of that will be highly challenging. So I might cut out some of this. So just note that when we release the risk assessment, there are a range of resources, so you can go onto our website and the full risk assessment. There's a couple of layers that you can probably find your entry point. But I just wanted to note we did release a data explorer on our website, and we're increasingly releasing data in sort of key drops. So there's a spatial tool on there that you can look down, mostly at about a 4 kilometre resolution nationally, to sort of see what the risks are in particular areas. So for those 10 hazards we used in the risk assessment, you can look at your location at 1.5, 2 degrees or 3 degrees of global warming, but you can also compare that with some of the exposure and vulnerability data. And everyone's been asking us since we released the risk assessment, when are you going to give us the data? And I'm happy to say that on the 16th of March we'll be releasing it, so you can ingest it into your own systems and start to use it in your own business context. And we'll be progressively releasing more. Some of the data, for example, at 4 kilometre resolution isn't that meaningless, it can be meaningless, but say, for example, in floods, we've picked some high priority areas to do some that get right down to street level, which we'll be releasing in the, as we complete it. So in wrapping up, agriculture has, you're setting the pace for the rest of us on how to adapt. I think there's opportunities for you to share some of your experiences with others, but the scale, speed and interconnected nature of the climate pressures now sits beyond sort of what individual producers can do, and there is that, I think listening to Sam earlier, there is that sort of need to think about how to collaborate across disciplines to learn from each other, but also across sectors. And I think that cross sectors isn't just agriculture in this context, or agriculture, fisheries and forestry. So, look, I think I might leave it there and open it up for questions, but I can't, though, leave knowing that it sounds really negative. If you go into the report, I do think by stress testing a range of features, we do actually now kind of go back to those questions. We can understand what do we need to adapt to, what do we need to learn to live with, and what are the sort of things that we might want to pull to change some of our future paths and maybe not feel as exposed. So don't feel like it's an Armageddon, feel like you've sort of been armed with some things that you can start to zoom in on and make some change. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Vicki. A lot to unpack there from the findings, and I guess some quite confronting findings there, very important, and that key takeaway about looking beyond the farm gate, a message from yesterday as well, about really understanding those outside risks. We might have time for a question from the floor, and we've got one over here. If you're able to introduce who you are as well, please, that would be great.
Hi Vicki, Larissa Taylor from Perth. Thank you to you and everyone at the Australian Climate Service. It's extraordinary science and now we have to incorporate it into our decision making. I've been lucky enough to work with some of your team and give it a bell with some farmers and supply chain people. And in a safe space amongst peers, it's extraordinary what people will do when they start applying it to their own situations. Could you just tell us the recent marine heatwave service from BOM, how much of that is incorporated, or just give us some insight into the marine content in the risk assessment, if you could?
Yeah, so we did, it was one of the hazards we certainly looked at, and, so of all those elements, ocean acidification and heat waves within the system were considered, and then we applied it to different systems. So there is data available. As far as the BOM marine heat wave warning, that it's not connected, it's more of an operational service. But one of the things that I suppose the ACS is keeps us up at night is trying to think about, all of the data and modelling that we might have, how do we turn that into a more operational service so groups can start to use it as new data and information comes to light. It's, I guess, packaged or translated in a way that's most meaningful. And it's one that's the sort of first cab off the rank where we're really looking hard at how we can sort of operationalise information to support decision making.
And Vicki, we've got a question just over here, please.
Yeah, Vicki, fantastic stuff. Martin Cole from Wine and the Exec of Council of RDCs. Just wondering, I think you've handled tipping points in kind of the broader uncertainties. I just wondered if you've got some thoughts about how, going forward, you'll be responding to as we get more information about critical tipping points.
Yeah, so the Australian Climate Service is sort of thinking of its role in sort of three key areas. So one's around, packaging things like the risk assessment or packaging data resources sort of in an integrated way to help decision making, and others guidance resources, and then there's sort of just sort of things like scenarios and other things. So tipping points is one that's in our guidance resources where it's going to move pretty quickly, but we're doing some deeper looks at different aspects of tipping points, but particularly in particular climate thresholds. But we're starting to look at some areas in the risk assessment where we sort of thought there's a threshold here that we need to better understand. As we do that work, we'll release them as sort of guidance documents, or in many cases, because it's moving so fast, it might be these are the questions we think you should answer that could help you identify the indicators or things that you might want to track to help you know if you're approaching a tipping point or even how to consider a tipping point. So we'll be putting out, probably 3 months, we'll be starting to put out more guidance resources.
I see we've got some questions coming in from online. If I can ask Scott to share one of those questions.
Where's Scott?
We have a question here from Merja Gulda Efira. Given the extreme and interconnected challenges that climate change presents for farmers and society, do you believe current Commonwealth and state agency arrangements are sufficient? Or is closer cross-jurisdictional collaboration or even a new super agency needed to effectively respond and adapt?
So climate change is one of those whole of society challenges requiring lots of different parties. So I personally don't think a super agency will help any of us. I do think, so certainly the way we think about it from a climate information point of view is we're trying to sort of go back a step, and at the moment what is occurring in the sort of climate information ecosystem is there's lots of us putting what I would describe as sort of patches. You know, we have an individual problem and we develop a tool or resource to respond to that particular area, but it can't be reused or used in other areas. So we're really looking at trying to get some sort of systematic approach to signal the sort of sort of constructs or indicators or things that can connect us. And I think in that context, we're looking at how we better collaborate across different sectors to, respond to the challenge. But I think we live in a federated system. That's not going to go away. So I think it's how we work within it and make it work effectively for us that's the focus. And I suppose one of the things we're thinking actively about is, there's a lot of people who want climate information, and we get a lot of emails on people wanting really customised information. We've just finished a national user needs analysis, which really looks at trying to work out what are the highest priority users and their information needs, and we've identified sort of 5 what we're calling user lenses. And just quickly, they're sort of people who might be approaching climate to understand loss and damage, which that tends to be like emergency service type sector, and insurers who are trying to understand what's the cost of that building falling down. There are people who are thinking about it from a people community, and they're sort of asking questions around, are there particular people, is there equity concerns, are there particular people in society that are impacted? Health tends to think of it like that. Enablers of society is one where we're sort of looking at, what are those things that enable us to function as a society well? So supply chains, energy. There's people who sort of are looking at those to either make sure those nodes or things are working well to enable us all. Productivity, growth and sustainability, environment are the sort of 5. And I suppose the way we're trying to think about those is, rather than do a supply push with lots more data and information, we're looking to have collaborations clustered around how people are trying to make decisions and bring different stakeholder groups together to try and package it to get it closer to where, closer to be able to support adaptation decision making. And as far as adaptation goes, it's everyone's business. It's, to me, what you did in biosecurity is the same as what we've got to do with climate. It's not going to be separate parallel lane. We're all going to have to take some responsibility to build it into the way we do business. So I don't think a super agency or anything is going to help. It's all of us have got to work out what role we play and get some clarity and collaboration across those roles.
Vicki, I'm just going to take one more very quick question from the audience to wrap us up, please.
Hi, Vic. I kind of said I wouldn't do this, but here we are.
Thanks, Matt.
Matt from Ricardo. And just to caveat my question, I'm very excited about March 16. I've already messaged a bunch of contacts telling them to look forward to that data, so keep that in mind. But as you know, a former Inspector General of the Murray Basin once described the proliferation of water data and information portals as slavish, and suggested that the overwhelming volume of data and information was actually a hindrance to shared understanding and decision making. And you could sort of describe the climate data landscape the same way. In addition to the ACS, a number of Commonwealth government agencies publish climate data. Each of the eastern states have their own climate data portals and different planning assumptions. The finance sector still use a lot of international climate projections. Is there a point at which production of data could hinder effective adaptation? And what more do we need to do to ensure that, to your last response, it's the adaptation is well supported?
Yes, and I think it already is. Either in some cases the lack of translated data and information to help someone navigate, which is why we've gone down that path to understand the different users and try and package the data and information in a meaningful way to those users rather than just sort of avalanche everybody with everything. I think when ACS was set up, there was this sort of, perception that we were going to in-house everything to do with climate risk data and information. And I suppose we've sort of been established for 4 years now. And I think the next phase of us is really about showing some national leadership to help leverage the national effort rather than sort of look like we're in-housing everything. Rather, we can try and help point to quality data and information and help sense make of it. So if you're looking to do this, these are the data sources and information you might want to use rather than it look like we're trying to create it all. I mean, that will take time, and I think we've probably had a couple of decades where we haven't organised the climate risk data ecosystem, so it's a bit of a, it's not that healthy, and I think as a result we have lots of indicators in some area, data and indicators in some areas, and then we're totally absent, and there are some pieces where adaptation decisions aren't being made because there's this, I don't have enough information, and it's actually, we just got to plug that hole. So taking a bit more of a systematic approach is important, and I think we're going to try and sort of publicly signal this is sort of what the national indicators and monitoring that we're going to take on, but also try and signal to the private sector the sort of areas that would add most value in helping either using these particular methods or data sources will enable, businesses who are getting services on climate risk to have more confidence in them and not have that sort of black box approach. But I think it is one that at the moment, the market research we've done is people are overwhelmed with the amount of information, and I guess they get climate's here, it's sort of a bit overwhelming, I'm not going to do anything. And so we've got to work out both how people, behavioural economic kind of stuff, how do we understand people and understand how to present the information in a way that's meaningful. And I don't know, I use Map My Fitness a bit with my team, and I use the app, and I put in how much exercise I've done and what I've eaten in a day, and it tells me that I can have another chocolate bar or whatever at the end of the day. I don't need to know all the shit that sits underneath that. It's invisible to me, all of the things that sit behind that, but at the front, I get what I need, and I've said we need that. We can't just push every piece of information because we're proud of it to people. We've got to translate it to make it meaningful, and I think that'll take time, but if we can work closely with decision makers and users, that's certainly the aspiration. Thanks.
Thank you so much. There's so many more questions coming in. I believe you're going to be about over lunchtime, so make sure you do catch up about those findings and look out for those on the 16th of March. Thank you so much for giving us a bit of a deep dive.